Amor che muove, language of the body and forms of desire in Dante, Pasolini and Morante. And I will be discussing the book with Manuele Gragnolati, the author of the book. He's Associate Professor of Italian Studies at Oxford and specialist of Dante and Medieval Studies. With Sara Fortuna, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Language at the Università Marconi in Rome, and Professor Jürgen Trabant, Emeritus Professor at the Freie Universität Romanistik, and a specialist of philosophy of language and linguistics. And I am Lara Scuriatti. I teach here at Bar College Berlin. I usually work on modernism, but I'm very, very pleased to introduce the book, which is incredibly surprising, innovative, and very insightful. And it's a book that presents a very interesting reading of three very important Italian authors: Dante, Pier, Paolo Pasolini, and Elsa Morante. And for those of you who may not be familiar with, well, Dante doesn't need any presentation, I guess. With Pier Paolo Pasolini was a very controversial, very important writer, intellectual, journalist, playwright, filmmaker, philosopher that died, was killed in 1975, and produced some of the most important texts and films in also Italy. Also very prophetic in his critique of the developments of Italian society, and I guess European society, we might say. Elsa Morante, also very important author, perhaps less known abroad. We will look, Manuele's book looks at her last novel, Araceli, published in 1982. And in dialogue with some of Pasolini's perhaps less known texts, La Mortaccia, a prose fragment, Divine Mimesis, which was a rewriting of Dante's comedy, and Petrolio, an unfinished novel published posthumously in 1992. Unfinished, Pasolini started writing it in 1972 and never managed to finish it. It's fragmentary, it's chaotic in its form, and very difficult. So I used the term initially surprising to define Manuele's book, and I'd like to qualify this briefly. It is surprising in many ways, and the first way in which it surprises us is the method. Well, because given the stance and the status of the three authors, and especially of Dante in Italian culture and in the history of literature, we might expect perhaps a reading that that focuses on influence. So, for example, on the influence of Dante, of his authority, and of the traces that Dante has left in Pasolini and Morante's work. They were both assiduous and very insightful readers of Dante himself. But this is not what we have here. It is a book that makes the text of these three authors dialogue with one another in a way that is non-linear, and it rejects and refuses the paradigm of influence and of a canonical trajectory, a theological trajectory as well of literature. So the title, Amor che muove, is borrowed from the very last verse of the Divine Comedy, which runs, Amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle, love that moves the sun and the other stars. which refers to, speaks to about divine love and the desire for it as a motor for the whole universe, that moves the whole universe. And it is under the sign of this movement and under the sign of this desire that the book operates. So, as I was saying, we are not experiencing here, we're not given a reading that tells us how Dante has influenced these authors and these texts. We are also not given, considering the topic, namely that of subjectivity and its relation to desire, language and corporeality. We're not given a history of the emergence of the modern subject and its crisis in the 20th century. Instead, Amor offers what the author calls a diffractive reading of this text. So namely, a reading that is based on Donna Haraway's model of diffraction. And I have put a quote on the handout for you of a passage from Donna Haraway's book that outlines this model. Namely, a reading that aims at letting texts interact with one another beyond and outside of the established categories. A method that allows the author to study these texts not as the evolution of one source into the other. We also have to remember that Pasolini and Elsa Morante read each other's works and also criticized each other's works. A method that, in fact, allows the author to study these texts as a cluster of texts that get entangled with one another, into one another, that crisscross paths, so that each and one of them may be, in a way, an instrument to shed light on the other, in an open dialogue that thrives on revisitation and open-endedness, and in which each text eventually changes as a result of the encounter with the other text, as the effect of this encounter. So this is done actually with a great and deep attention to the historical, cultural, and critical context of the production of these texts and the reception, a critical reception of the texts themselves. It doesn't turn them into empty objects that await revitalization or to be filled with meaning by a new theoretical gesture. It is clearly the book of a Dantist, which is informed by the author's passion for Dante's work, and also for the immense and surprising possibilities offered by Dante's work, and its capacity to actually dialogue with modern and postmodern philosophy, with queer and gender theory, with contemporary politics, literary theory.
Stay with us.
It's also surprising because I would say it has a spiral-like form, which begins with Dante's Vita Nuova and with a rime, moves to Pasolini's Divina Mimesis, La Mortaccia, a prose fragment. The Divina Mimesis is a rewriting of Dante's Divine Comedy, as I said, and to Petrolio. To then move back again to the Divine Comedy, to an analysis of corporeality in Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, and then to Elsa Morante's Araceli, to then return to Dante, and to then return to all three. So it begins, I said, with a Vita Nuova, and with an exploration of the Vita Nuova's performative operation, namely the creation of the figure of the author as writer, as organizer and interpreter of his own past and of his own work, and as a figure of authority, whose desire for the beloved is actually through the operation of transforming the rime, collection of single poems, into a closed text, the Vita Nuova. So this desire for the beloved is reinscribed within very strict moral and teleological exemplary paradigm of salvation. And the masterly agency, this mastery of the author, is actually mirrored by the shape of the work of the text itself, and by the prefiguration in this text of also the appearance, the writing of Dante's great work, namely the Divine Comedy. So from this, then the text, Manuele's book, moves to the exploration of Pasolini's Divina Mimesis and the first fragment, La Mortaccia, which, as Manuele puts it, is an operation that redoes and undoes Dante by taking up the complex interaction of plurilingualism and intersubjectivity of the Divine Comedy in order to then destroy the tight version of authorship, subjectivity and teleology, which in the book we're told are shaping the operation of the Vita Nuova. And in the book we're told or shown how Pasolini's undoing of Dante becomes, of Dante's paradigms, becomes even more radical in Petrolio, where the renunciation of the forms of subjectivity and individuality, which Pasolini sees as being at the root of the violence of bourgeois society, is mirrored, once again, in the fragmentary form of the text. So Petrolio, as I said, was never finished, and it's fragmentary, it's very chaotic, magmatic is the adjective that you use. So it's a failed novel in many ways that denies the reader a conventional narrative, linear narrative, which for Pasolini, as Manuel claims, is the expression of a sort of violent desire for shaping, organizing, and possessing the world. So Manuele reads the operation of Pasolini's Petrolio as a queer performance, and I guess you will say a bit more about this, namely the performance of a dissolved, undomesticated subjectivity without history. His desire has no proper object and is therefore plainly paradoxical, and based on a corporeality which is extremely prominent, but is no guarantor for a self, for subjectivity, for the formation of a self. So after this, we return once again to the Divine Comedy, or rather we go to the Divine Comedy with a focus on the question of aerial bodies. Now, those of you who've attended our courses are very familiar with this. So the aerial bodies, those strange, unsubstantial bodily shapes with the soul, in which the soul are sort of embodied in the afterlife. And these chapters are, to me, particularly fascinating because of the complex investigation of medieval theology, embryology, but also because Manuele makes us aware of the productive resonance between some of the medieval theories on the body and also postmodern ones. And this I find really extremely interesting and very productive. And I must say they're also my favorite chapters in the book because of the wonderful discussion of the impossible embraces between the living and the dead, which we might talk about more of it later. So in these chapters, Manuele identifies a marked difference in the meaning of corporeality and its relation to desire between Inferno and Purgatory on the one hand and Paradiso, and shows that surprisingly, and this is something that will emerge also later on in the book, find at the very end of the comedy in Paradise, where we might expect to find a kind of apotheosis of the teleological paradigm that has informed the whole comedy. In fact, we find a form of nonlinear desire and textuality, relational desire, and it is Gragnolati's actually diffractive reading that has made the emergence of this strange ending, of this important and contradicting aspect in the comedy actually possible. So we then move to Elsa Morante Zaraceli, a novel in which the protagonist, Manuele, accomplishes a journey to Spain, to Andalusia, in search of his dead mother. So it's a kind of journey into the afterlife. And here, the connection between language, desire, and corporeality accrues around the motif of resurrection, of the resurrection of the body, which is experienced as a relational mode of subjectivity. And it's expressed by a temporally contorted, expanded textual form, and also by a pre-symbolic maternal language, which I think Sara will tell us about, I guess. So in this part also, Manuele returns to Pasolini also, and lets emerge a difference between Morante and Pasolini's operations, where we're alerted to the fact that, as we might think that these operations are very similar, in fact, whereas Pasolini's textuality fragments and destroys the subject and the ego, in Morante Zaraceli, in fact, the body doesn't even manage to get to form a coherent normative subject, and then acts a journey that leads the text to accept a kind of self without boundaries, partial and always relational. And this returns us to Paradise, to Paradiso, to alert us to the problematic temporality in the second half of the Cantica, and its articulation of desire and subjectivity, whereby we are shown that in the very moment when desire continuously renews itself in the moment that it is satisfied, and that seems to produce finally a realized, accomplished self, which is united with, in which body and soul unite. In fact, that Manuele shows us that this doesn't happen, that the Divine Comedy in fact denies and doubts this moment. And this reminds me actually of a great lecture that Catherine gave on Hamlet many years ago, in which you argued actually that it is precisely in that moment when the subject actually gets spoken about, also grammatically, it ends up being a void and ends up being a problem. in itself. But that's, I guess, another story.
As you're seeing Laura as a great presenter of other people's work.
On the basis of this, we are left with an incredible, open, rich apparatus in which we understand how these three texts, these various texts of these three authors encounter one another, and how it is in fact in your reading precisely these encounters outside of historical paradigms of literary history and criticism that make it possible to let this text, let these incredibly important aspects and contradictory aspects of this text that even sometimes seem to deny the very intention of that the text so forcefully present us with, that these aspects can only emerge through this particular diffractive reading, so this particular way of making text speak to one another. So after this, I would like to hand my virtual microphone
To me. Okay, so it's woman, man, and I liked your adjective, surprising. Yeah, it's a surprising book. That's really true, and in a certain way, you told the story, which we'll now repeat, and I think repetitio est mater studiorum, so we'll repeat. Certainly, we have to repeat what Laura already said, but I try not to repeat too much of the things she already said. And of course, but once more, I want to stress the fact that the title is alluding to the last verse of the Divine Comedy, and I think this is really important, and because it's important also because all the Italians know that there is this allusion, but we do not necessarily know. We are not Italians, so it's like I don't know, like giving to a book in German the title Ach Neige, something like that. Ach Neige, everybody knows this is Goethe. So Amor, everyone knows that this is Dante, and yes, and it's of course, as you always say, it's about Dante, but it's about three poets. It's about Dante, it's about Pasolini, and it's about Morante. So we have a triangle here, and you already described it nicely as a spiral. So I would add to that geometry. I would like the more traditional geometry of the triad, of the triangle, because this also then comes back in the triangle of the subtitle, but the subtitle is not very triadic. However, my triad would be language, body, and desire. Desire, body, language. Of course, it's not a real separation, but however, we have this triad. Love, body, and language, also in the main issues of the book. And what I want to do, I want to talk about language. About language, since I'm a linguist, so of course I'm mostly interested in the linguistic aspects of that surprising book. And in order to do so, I just would like, in a little first part, remind you of the role of Dante. For the Italian language and for the discussion on language in general. So we all know, yes, Dante is the father of the Italian language in a certain way, and of course Dante is the most important poet in that language. But it's not as, of course, to the Dantists they know, but generally it's not so much known that he is also the most important language philosopher, let's say between St. Augustine and, I would say, Herder in Germany. So he's the most important medieval language philosopher. Of course, we cannot now show here now his language philosophy, which he developed mainly in the De Vulgaria Eloquentia. But I would just say something about the language items that then are important for Lele's book. So, of course, the situation of Dante is that duality of Latin and Vulgare. Well, Latin and Vulgare, and he, as many intellectuals in that time, they are bilingual. This is what you call, or the cultural diglossia of the time is Latin and Vulgare. Latin is for scholarship, for erudition, law, and so on and so forth, and the Vulgare is for poetry. And of course for normal life, yeah, the low life of the time. So, and here is Dante, and he is a very proud man, and a very erudite man, and he wants to write poetry in the Vulgare, but then he asks him, what Vulgare? Where is my Vulgare? Where is the language I need? Because he wants to write high poetry. He doesn't want to write just vulgar poetry, but very high. So he asks, where is my language? And he looks in Italy and he doesn't find the language. So he constructs one. He constructs the idea of an ideal language for poetry. This is what he does in De Vulgaria Eloquentia. But then he becomes a poet, or he is already a poet, but then he writes the Divine Comedy, and then he creates a real language. He does not only construct an ideal language, but he really writes his wonderful poem in a language that is not an ideal language, a language that is, as Manuele often says, is a plurilingual language, and the text is a plurilingual text. It's not a pure text of Tuscany or something like that. It's a plurilingual text with many traces of all Italian dialects, with Occitan, with French, Hebrew, Latin, and so it's a plurilingual text. And this is, as I said, since he is the father of the Italian language, so the Italian literary language is also inherently plurilingual. So, and this is, I think this is important to show the point of departure. So, but within Dante, and this is another thing I wanted to say, within Dante we have two different positions regarding language. So first, when he goes through the Italian dialects, he says, oh, those dialects are horrible. So variety is a horror. And then he goes into, he writes his book, he writes his Divine Comedy, and their variety does become a joy. And Adam himself, at the end of the Divine Comedy, expresses a kind of joy of variety. He says, now language varies, and this is a wonderful thing, and speak as you like. Come va bella, says Adam. So there is this change from the horror of variety to the joy of variety. So, and now my second part on the book. What does Lele say about language in that triangle, once more, between Dante, Pasolini, and Morante? Not so much, and so as we have seen, there are 7 chapters. He doesn't say so very much about the language in the first chapter, which is on the Vita Nuova. But the Vita Nuova, and this is interesting, I think the Vita Nuova, as you show it, the Vita Nuova has the same, let's say, gesture as the Divine Comedy, because it integrates into it synthesizes, it integrates into a whole different individuals, if you want, because the poems were already there. And then Dante collected them into a book and united them in the Vita Nuova and invents a narrative to integrate those books. So the same gesture as integrating variety in a text. And thereby, and this is what Laura already said, thereby also creating the figure of the modern author, the authoritative modern author, who is the master of the narrative also. And this then is destroyed in the next chapters, as you show it, by Pasolini. Pasolini very closely, he really answers to Dante in so many. He destroys that figure of the authoritative author, and also I would say he's linguistically is certainly the most interesting author of the three, of the two, because he directly answers to Dante in a way. So what he finds when he starts working, he finds that wonderful Italian language with an interior plurilingualism, and he finds also in Italy the dialects. This is his situation. He writes these wonderful books, which you treat indirectly, the Ragazzi di Vita, for example, the Ragazzi di Vita, where the Roman dialect is important. And here we find everything in that dialect. We find also the scent of the boys who speak these dialects. And there are wonderful quotes about this, because those boys really have a scent and they have a taste. And their sexes have tastes, so this is very perilous. And the language has taste. The sex of these boys have taste. And then what happens in the life of Pasolini? So this is destroyed. Both things are destroyed. The Italian language is destroyed. He complains. His lamento about the destruction of the Italian language is very famous. So he says, modern life destroys, the Italian becomes a technical language, and it also destroys the dialects. The Ragazzi di Vita do not exist anymore. They do not taste anymore, they do not smell anymore, as well as their language is destroyed. So it's a real cultural destruction that is described in what you show us also in these chapters. So a cultural, a real cultural catastrophe. So from the old constellation of language and dialects to a new and interesting and perhaps also, of course, Pasolini exaggerates this, but I will come, at the end of my seminar, I will come back to this, because I think it's more important than I thought before I read your book. So this is the language theme in Pasolini. Of course, as Laura had already shown, he has this Dante mimesis, so he really goes directly and answers directly to Dante. But what the point I wanted to show is that in this book, so this cultural destruction of language is nicely depicted and strongly shown. The Dante chapters, for instance, I do not find the Dante chapters so interesting. I'm not a Dante specialist, I have to say. So because in those two chapters there is few on language. It's, as you saw, it's about the soul and the body and the embraces of between dead and living people. Of course, this is very interesting too. But these are not my favorite chapters. So therefore I go to the two Morante chapters. Perhaps what you should say also to say, Dante is the most important Italian woman writer. There is no other figure in Italian literature like her. Who else? Colonna, perhaps. But there is no other important woman writer in the literary history. She is the Italian writer. So and hence also the triangle is a triangle between Dante and perhaps the two most important writers of the 20th century in Italy. So Dante and I think and I will then close also. I think Sara will talk about this. It's also about the origin of language. And I'm sure Sara will talk about this. It's about the main figure, Manuele, has a mother who talks Spanish and Italian at the same time. So the first language is a kind of mixture. It's not a very clear language. It's very much connected to the breast, and I'm sure Sara will talk about this. So there is an origin, a maternal origin of language. The locutio materna, so the mother tongue, is really a mother's tongue in that book, and it's very strongly the Araceli novel shows this very, very, very nicely. And it's also an opposition between the locutio materna and what in former times we call the sermo patrios, so the language of the father. Locutio materna is that, by the way, the more modern term. Sermo patrios is the old Latin term. So there's a fight between the language of the mother and the language of the father. And the language of the father is, of course, the language with the rules, and so it's a very phallic language in a certain way. But the main figure, so Manuel loses his mother, and then he goes back from Italy to Spain. He goes back to the origin, and this is also very interesting how the so-called foreign language is then rediscovered. So the foreign language is at the same time the language of the origin is then rediscovered in Spain, and by that movement again also the father's language can become a language of love, and this is what you show so nicely. So this here we have a spiral. I see a movement of a circle here. Okay, so. The conclusion. My conclusion is in his book and also in his authors, we find a surprising writing about what I call the three eternal questions of language. Three eternal questions of language is origin, what is language for, and variety, variation. How do we deal with linguistic variation? And on all these things, the authors say interesting things, and of course Manuele says very different, or shows these interesting things about language. So, and now my final remark is, yes, this book is on language in Italy in a certain way, but it is also a book on the linguistic situation today. Because what I've found now so interesting in reconsidering our own linguistic situation is that what Pasolini laments about is what we are in. I mean, we are losing our languages as the Italians lost their dialects and their interesting literary language, and we go towards the language we are talking here. So, and I think this language I'm talking here now has no taste, not to me at least. It doesn't smell like I smell. It's a language, and we are using this in this strange new world. And this is exactly what Pasolini complained about, and this is what I learned so intensively with his book, which he had written in Italian. And so, of course, he goes back to Italy. He gives taste to his language and to his literary scholarship. Yeah, this is what I want to say. So thank you for the book.
First of all, thank you, Laura, for inviting me. And I learned a lot from you and Jürgen. And of course, the last person has nothing to say. I tried to tell you something, and of course for me it's a special pleasure to present this book here in Berlin. We also presented it in Paris, but with Lele we met in Berlin, and we became friends, and then we started to work together and also to think about many topics this book deals with. So it's really important for me, and of course I also had the pleasure to work with Laura and with Jürgen, and with Jürgen and Lele we also work together on Dante, so there are so many connections. And I would like also to start also saying that the existential and also scholarly path, life of Lele led him in many different places, and so you can also say of Lele what Dante said of himself in the Vulgari Eloquenza. Manuele Gragnolati, cui mundus et patria, vel descens ecco. Lele is there. And at the same time, I think you would agree with me if I tell you that this path has taken out a rather European character, because after a very long American period during his PhD and then the first teaching period also in America, Lele came back to Europe, and here created really a very dense affective network of relationships, especially between Oxford, Berlin, and also Italy, of course, where his family lives, part of his family. I believe that this book, then you have just said it, this book can really be considered as a coming back to Italian, to the language, Lele's mother tongue. A coming back really in his scholarly activity, in his academic writing, but not only, of course, because this is not just an academic book. Then, although Lele has already published many articles also in Italian, in fact, this is his first book in this language, in Italian. And I think that, and I think that his choice to write Amor che muove in Italian has an important meaning. Of course, we could have written it in English. And reading, then I really would like Lele to tell something about it, about this choice, because I think that it's really meaningful. And in particular, I would like to know how you experience the rewriting of aspects of this book. You probably thought at first in English, in America during your PhD. And while reading this book, I really perceived the influence of English. English not in just a linguistic sense, in a broader sense, in a cultural sense, because I think that the wonderful clarity of this book's language and it's the effect of this linguistic and cultural translation. And for example, I perceived this cultural influence in the explicit intention and desire to help the reader to enter the complex critical world he is presenting. And this is really not common in a essay like that. And in fact, in the introduction, Lele proposes something very original, a sort of deal, a pact with the reader, un patto. He will accompany her, him, step by step, making as easy and accessible as possible the most complicated theories and also the hermeneutic paradigms he uses, but he wishes that the reader, in exchange, considers the possibility of being transformed by the critical path proposed by Amor che muove, actively applying it in different ways, and I think you not just mean academic ways. And I think that this call to the reader is really not usual in the way we are trained in the academia. And I think that it depends, on the one hand, of course, on the radical critical intervention proposed by Amor che muove, which is, of course, linked with the personal existential character. But on the other hand, and I think that Laura agrees because she mentioned this element, I believe that what made it possible, I mean, this freedom, this openness, it's really a different critical culture, which is more common in the America or Anglophone world, also Dante studies. In the Italian context, still Laura told us, strongly biased by a sort of historical methodology, this freedom and openness toward the readers would have been inconceivable, I think, I cannot imagine something similar. And the fact that this book is written in Italian, which is the author's language, has on the other side also positive aspects. I think that the fluidity, the perspicuity of his style and the intimate tone of Amor che muove also, of course, depends on this fact that it's your mother language. And of course, Jürgen, you already mentioned that one cannot but think to the relation between Latin and Vulgare in Dante, or between Italian and Spanish in Morante's novel Araceli, explored by the book. One could object that the sociolinguistic relation between the European languages and English as the global language, globalesisch, as Jürgen Trabant calls it in his last book, is very different. Of course, you cannot compare the two relationships, Latin and Vulgare and English as globalesisch, globalese, and Italian. And in fact, my point in my short remarks will be different, because I would like to draw your attention to an important dimension of Lele's book, not only concerning the linguistic dimension, which is important but not so important, but really I would like to stress the importance of what is called self-refractivity. In fact, Lele's books manifest in many respects this dimension, self-reflectivity. And what is self-reflectivity? This is this idea that a text, in this case concretely this book, reflects in its shapes the mode of composition, and in the mode of composition, the context it presents. And I already mentioned that this book originates from a rewriting of independent essays, mostly in English, but not only, and a sort, which is more important, of re-signification of them via the global configuration in which they are diffracted. And they are diffracted, as you heard, using the original methodology of Donna Haraway. And Lele's compositional strategies is strange, but it's true, has some similarities to that implemented by Dante in the Vita Nuova, to which is dedicated the first chapter of the book. Lele reads the Vita Nuova as a performative textual act that gives a new meaning to the lyrics previously written by Dante. And Lele effectively argues that Dante is so skilled in his textual performance that he succeeds in convince some critics that this is the new configuration is objective, and then for these critics it's necessary to submit their interpretation to Dante's dicta. No longer recognize any legitimacy to the independent status of the lyrics, which were written before in a different historical context, in a different biographical situation. Of course, Gragnolati refuses this critical position, highlighting precisely the performative nature of Dante's Vita Nuova, and the fact that one can and even should look to the lyrics included in the Vita Nuova in a double perspective. This is the idea, and I think this book really tried to keep this double perspective. The new perspective, the new configuration presented by Dante, but also, now we are going to see, by Amor che muove, and then, of course, the previous meaning of the lyrics, in the case of the Vita Nuova, and of the previous research and works of Lele. So, what does Gragnolati in Amor che Muove? He creates a sort of very original textual physiognomy which reflects his critical interpretation of Dante's Vita Nuova and also of Pasolini's Divina Mimesis, which Leles reads more, and this is new in the Pasolini studies, more in connection with Dante's Vita Nuova than with the Commedia, which is the usual way. And you read it as a sort of inversion of Dante's Vita Nuova, a destructive performance of the authorial power. And then he also uses Morante, Araceli, which is the last novel of this writer, and it's a novel which overcomes the traditional narrative structure. If you know Morante, the last novels have a very classical structure. Araceli is completely different. The classical novel, the 18th century novels, explodes, and you have a very stratificated, fragmented structure in Araceli with different temporality, with go forth and back, and so on. And with all this lively, affective matter, Amor che Muove constructs what Wittgenstein would have called, I think, a perspicuous representation, eine übersichtliche Darstellung, which put together in a particular configuration Dante, Vita Nuova and Commedia in the foreground, but also, as Jürgen told us, the Vulgari Eloquenza and Convivio when confronting the relationship between Latin and Vulgare, alias father and mother tone. Pasolini, and the focus, of course, is on Divina Mimesis and Petrolio, but within the whole context of the last critical and artistic production of Pasolini, and Morante. And here, of course, the focus is on Araceli, but you can find all the reference to the topic also present, language, subjectivity, resurrection, also present in all other novels of Morante, so it's quite complete as a view. And I think it's important to observe that the perspicuity obtained by this critical work is due, first of all, to this selectivity. Its aims is not analyzing the topic of the body and desire in all the works of these authors, nor, stresses Gragnolati in the introduction, proving a general historiographical hypothesis on this topic. Amor che Muove embraces a sort of critical modesty, and hereby succeeding, and it's indeed a great success, in making evident a series of connections. And the perspicuity is really that, is showing you the connections. And I would like to present again some connections, because it could seem trivial, but it's really not. The first one, already mentioned, is the link between the performative construction of Dante's Vita Nuova and the performative destruction of Pasolini's Divina Mimesis, also continued in Petrolio. And Gragnolati argues, and this is also quite innovative, that these works are in a relation of mutual influence. And the second connection links the topic of corporeality, and then the bond between soul and body, and the topic of resurrection in the Commedia, and in particular in Paradiso, focusing on the original solution given by Dante, with the theme of corporeality and resurrection taken up in Morante's novel, Araceli. And here, and this is really a very important element, the analysis assumes also a linguistic dimension, because resurrection in Araceli is not only the resurrection of the body, but also of language, that is of Manuele's mother tongue, in the sense the first language heard by the mother, which is Spanish. And here, of course, the topic is origin of language, because it's also a very philosophical novel, and mother tongue, that is the language we learn in the first 4 years of our life, is also connected to what Kristeva calls the semiotic, a sort of pre-symbolic, pre-logical, pre-rational language, which is more connected to expressivity, to gesture, to rhythmic patterns, and so on. And on the one hand, Araceli, which is the mother of the protagonist, Manuele, progressively suppresses Spanish, submitting herself to what we could call ironically the Italian civilization during the fascist period. And on the other hand, her son, the protagonist of the novel, Manuele, completely removes, in a psychoanalytic sense, Spanish after his mother's death. But he becomes eventually able to recover it during the journey in Andalusia in search of a meeting with her. And this encounter with the mother is really the key, because it will allow him to overcome his melancholy block, and then also to recover, as you mentioned, the fatherly dimension, discovering his love for the father, and on the textual level, also putting the motherly dimension into Italian again. And I would like to say that as I wrote together with Lele the previous article devoted to Araceli. I really could appreciate, and also I try to present precisely, the genial diffractive effect in the rewriting of this part. And the diffractive effect is due to a particular contextualization in the book. That is, the fact that after presenting this part on Araceli and on the resurrection of language in Araceli, Lele comes back to Dante. And this coming back to Dante, analyzing the idea of resurrection in Paradiso, above all the last canti of Paradiso, allows him to put together two topics. On the one hand, the problem of soul and body and corporeality, which was the topic of his first book in English, and the other topic, the topic of the resurrection of resurrection of poetic language in the last canti of Paradiso, and that is that all the linguistic topic find a very interesting connection with the other topic, and here explaining how the poetic a different kind of poetic language emerges in the last canti of Paradiso. Lele uses the studies of a very important American Dantist, Teodolinda Barolini, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a study of another American Dantist, Gary Cestaro, who shows that the poetic revolution of the last canti of Paradiso is surprisingly connected with the emergence, the obsessive emerging of a constellation of images, the breastfeeding, l'allattamento al seno materno, the milk, the idea of the baby who brings the mother's milk. And so we have these images, and we have a language which is less and less discursive, analytical, logical, and is more and more affective. And why? Because of course, approaching the final divine vision, the poet has also to abandon language. Of course, at the end, it's only the silence. In the vision, there is no language. So we can also try to approach without really being able to express the vision. But why I think that this diffraction is particularly difficult and succeeds, because of course, Dante, it's not easy to diffract, and to diffract the last canti of the Commedia, it's not easy. And what happens? What does Lele show? He shows a particular tension between this mystical, let's say, this mystical movement, this losing a sort of logical, discursive language, and on the other hand, we have this idea that at the same time there is a sort of paradox, but we can also say a sort of contradiction, because Dante is there with the body, and Lele reminds that the idea is that after the resurrection, the vision of God will be more perfect, even more perfect. It's sort of paradox again. Because the blessed are already happy and cannot be more happy, but and at the same time you think, okay, but more corporeality is also more individuality, is more, and then there is a sort of tension. Okay, you have to abandon the self, but at the same time you also will be more yourself. With your body, you could be able to have even more complete affective relationship. And Lele, of course, leaves it open, and then we will tell maybe something about that. You have this tension, this contradiction, or in the last part of Paradiso. So Dante, we are used to see Dante as a sort of monolith, a perfect poet, but we also see a tension which cannot be resolved. Yeah.
Thank you, Sara. And I guess that now it's your time to respond.
Just briefly, thank you, Laura. Really, for me, I've been lecturing here so many times, like about Dante, that it is really a pleasure to be able to speak about my book on love, because I was lecturing during the course on desire and love in Western culture, I guess. And so it's really a very great pleasure to be here with Laura, with Sara, and with Jürgen, with whom I have shared significant aspects of the past that have led to this book, which I'm sure sounds crazy to you, at this point. Because, maybe for those of you who are not really familiar with these authors, and I'm so happy, I've learned so much from it. It was just so clear and also stimulating to see how the book can be diffracted by further readings. And Sara was speaking about a pact that I made with the readers, and for me it's such a pleasure and a honor when it happens, when people take it seriously and sort of give it new meaning through their own reading. So for me, really, all of these for me has been really fantastic and extremely clear and stimulating. Maybe for those of you who know less, this text or the book, at least you have an idea of the reading that I have attempted. So I don't know how I can respond, or what should I do. Maybe, I don't know, because you have all raised very important aspects. So I don't know, maybe first I just read a couple of passages by Dante and one passage by Elsa Morante and see, precisely what a very profound and I hope not too long diffraction that for me has been very important, and then I sort of complicate it. So, I don't know, first of all, I don't know, for me also Donna Haraway has been very important, but also Anne Carson, what she does when she reads Simonides of Chaos with Paul Celan, and this quotation is the epigraph of my book. Sometimes you can see a celestial object better by looking at something else with it in the sky. Okay? So this is, sort of like Carson's poetic, beautiful way of doing what Donna Haraway defines in this way. And so Donna Haraway's, the term diffraction is taken by optics, and it's the phenomenon according to which light waves encountering an object do not produce a shadow that repeats the exact form of the object, but produce a complex diffraction patterns that depends both on the waves and the object. And this is razor diffracted. And I love it because it turns into an object that in a way keeps the original one, but then acquires also another one that depends on the nature of the waves that diffract. So it's not a reflection, it's a diffraction. And I like to think of it sort of like an Islamic piece of an Islamic ceremony, what before was a razor. So and what Carson defines so poetically, but also then performed in her reading of these two poets, Haraway defines like this: diffraction patterns record a history of interaction, interference, reinforcement, difference. Diffraction is about heterogeneous history, not about originals. Unlike reflections, diffractions not displace the same elsewhere in more or less distorted form, thereby giving rise to injustice of metaphysics. Rather, diffraction can be a metaphor for another kind of critical consciousness, one committed to make a difference and not to representing the sacred image of the same. And with Dante, when you deal with Dante and you read Dante with other authors, you are always in danger of precisely repeating the idea that the other texts are copies and therefore not as perfect as the original. So I really wanted to move away from that and create a reading where precisely by looking at one with the other one, you create other, you see other things. And maybe also you create other texts. And so as an example of this diffraction, I just want to read two passages. One is from Purgatorio, the beginning of Purgatorio, where Dante encounters an old friend. And as Lara was saying, we are in the moment in Christian eschatology where souls are separated from their bodies. Dante imagines that when the soul separates from its body and gets to the afterlife, it creates a body of air, an aerial body, that gives it both a shape and all physical sensitive faculties. But these beings, which Dante calls ombre, shades, have an aspect and sensitive faculties, but they do not have substantiality. The way in which Dante sort of speaks about this substantiality, one of the ways is when Dante, the character, encounters an old friend from Florence, Casella, and they try to embrace each other. And so it's a very affective, emotional moment where Dante is thinking back of his youth in Florence before the exile. He encounters a shade. They recognize each other. They haven't seen each other for a long time. Dante has been exiled. No, sorry, in 1300 Dante is not exiled, but when he writes the poem, he is exiled. But anyway, they meet and they try to embrace. Io vidi una di loro trarresi avanti per abbracciarmi con sì grande affetto che mosse me a farlo somigliante. Of course, and here Dante is rewriting Virgil, who was at the same time rewriting Homer, even though Dante does not know Homer. It's the impossibility of in a way, connecting again. It's a symbol of loss. A living and a dead are separated. They cannot embrace. And this is what the poet laments. Oi ombre vane, fuorché nell'aspetto, or empty shades, except in aspect. That is, shades have this shape, they have sensitive faculties, but they do not have substantiality, and therefore the embrace cannot take place. Oi ombre vane, fuorché nell'aspetto, 3 volte dietro a lei le mani avvinsi, e tante mi tornai con esse al petto. So, like, this failed embrace, which resonates again with all classical literature, is a symbol of imperfection. What happens is that then Dante asks this guy who was a musician, can you please perform one of my older songs? And this guy begins to sing in the most beautiful, sweet way that all the souls forget that they are in purgatory and only are enchanted by this performance. Cato, the guardian of purgatory, arrives and tells them, sorry guys, are you crazy? You're here listening to this guy performing a canzone by Dante. You should go, stop immediately, and get your way back to the path that will lead you to God. So, in a way, purgatory is the place that teaches the souls that they should not want to embrace their beloved again. Purgatory is the place, I call it the therapy of pain. Through pain, the souls are taught to stop looking backwards and to look forwards. So that's what the very harsh Augustinian paradigm of purgatory teaches, is that the soul must stop to desire to reconnect or to think again of their beloved on earth. They only have to focus on God. So, this is what purgatory teaches. In a way, it's a course on dispossession. It's a course about selflessness. It's a course that teaches how one has to relinquish obsession with the ego and has to open up to an ideal community where everybody matters like anybody else, and any personal attachment is to be abandoned. Once you learn how to love unconditionally everybody, like Christ on the cross loved anybody else, then you're allowed to heaven. When you get to heaven, indeed, you have this sort of like merging with God through the vision of God, where you have learned what in medieval Christian terms is called charity, caritas, which is opposite of eros. It's this sort of impersonal and uber-general kind of love. So that's what heaven is. But what is interesting is that when you get to the middle of Paradiso, you find souls that actually, even though they are supposed to be so very happy in the vision of God, and indeed they are, they still desire their bodies, precisely because something else will happen. And so what I want to show is the passage in which the Soul of Solomon explains what will happen when the resurrection of the body comes back. Because I was telling you, we are in the moment where souls are separated from their bodies. Bodies will come back, according to the Christian doctrine, only at the end of time, when after the last judgment, the fleshly body, not the real body, will come back and the person will be reunited in its wholeness. So Dante wonders, if everything is just so perfect before the resurrection, what's the point of insisting about the resurrection of the body? Beatrice reads this question in his mind, formulates it, and the Soul of Solomon explains what happens when the bodies come back. So this is the end of time. Come la carne, gloriosa e santa, fia rivestita, la nostra persona più grata fia per essere tutta quanta. So, whole again. Perché s'accrescerà ciò che ne dona di gratuito lume il sommo bene, lume che a lui veder ne condiziona, onde la visione crescer convene, crescer l'ardor che di quella s'accende, crescer lo raggio che da esso viene. Super complicated passage where Dante is dealing very specifically with different theories about soul, body, vision, perception. But what matters to me is the idea that when the glorious and sanctified flesh, and not the air, the flesh, will come back, the vision of God will increase, because it will be possible to have more access to the vision, to the vision. And therefore, there will be more glory and more light that expresses this glory. So far, so good. Just a little bit a little paradox of the idea of a fullness that will be fuller when something comes back, when the body comes back. But what is astonishing, but here we are still within theology, what is astonishing is that when the souls listen to these guys speaking about the resurrection of the body, they show such a sign of happiness, and this happiness is not only related to the fact that their vision of God will increase, but it is connected to the fact that they will be able to see, find again, and interact again with their beloved. The beloved that they were supposed to have forgotten or put aside during the harsh therapy of purgatory. So let's read it. So that this is what Solomon says about the resurrection of the body, and this is the reaction that the souls have afterwards. Tanto mi parver subiti e accorti, e l'uno e l'altro coro a dicer amme, che ben mostrar disio dei corpi morti. So what the souls show is that they still desire their dead bodies. They show desire for their dead bodies. Che ben mostrar disio dei corpi morti. And why? Forse non pur per loro, maybe not just for them, ma per le mamme, per i padri e per gli altri che fuor cari, anzi che fossero sempiterne fiamme. So what this desire for body expresses is the idea that with the resurrection of the flesh, the resurrection of the flesh somewhat will coincide with the possibility to reunite again with one's own beloved. Le mamme, i padri e gli altri che fuor cari, anziché forse sempiterne fiamme. And in a nutshell, I see this as this clash between the sort of a Christian epos and the lyrical world that the Divine Comedy puts together in a way that does not synthesize. So this was, in a way, something that I have really thought a lot about. But the question that for me remained was that of understanding this relationship between corporeality, memory, personality, and affectivity. What has allowed me to understand what Dante means is Elsa Morante. That's the sort of diffractive reading that I have tried to do. And especially in a passage of Araceli where for us, for Sara and I, it was very funny, and then now it is embarrassing. The protagonist of Araceli is called Manuele. So that's why when I speak about this novel, I love it when people call me Lele, so that it is clear that I am also maybe even more screwed up than the character of Elsa Morante, but at least we are different because it is a very tormented protagonist. But this protagonist, at a certain point, begins a journey back to Spain, where he wants to find his dead mother, Araceli, the character that gives name to the novel. So the protagonist begins this journey, and at a certain point, at the very beginning of this very contorted, fluid novel, the protagonist tells the reader why he has begun this journey, and he explains it this way. I read it, maybe I read it first because it's very important. I read it first in English and then in Morante's amazing language. The temptation of the journey had possessed me of late with the very voice of my mother. It was not an abstract transcription of memory that brought me back her earliest list of songs, firmly buried, but her real bodily voice with its tender savor of throat and saliva. Here is the image of the breastfeeding. That's what Sara was referring to. What the character, in a way, reenacts or rediscovers is the intimate relationship with the mother in the action of suckling from her breast, which is also the origin of language and subjectivity. I felt again on my palate the sensation of her skin, which smelled of fresh plum. And at night, in this Milanese cold, I sensed her still girlish breath, like a skin of ingenious warmth on my aged eyelids. I don't know how scientists explain the existence inside our corporeal matter or these other hidden organs of feeling without visible body, segregated from objects, and yet capable of hearing, seeing, and every natural sensations, and others as well. You would say that they are equipped with antennae and sounding lines. They operate in a field cut off from space, but of unlimited movement, and in that zone, there takes place, at least as long as we live, the carnal resurrection of the dead. So let me read in Italian just because it's much more beautiful. Especially because it's the original language and also because, in a way, my Milanese accent works well now. La tentazione del viaggio mi aveva invaso recentemente con la voce stessa di mia madre. Non è stata una trascrizione astratta della memoria a restituirmi le sue primissime canzoncine, già seppellite, ma proprio la voce fisica di lei, col suo sapore tenero di gola e di saliva. Ho riavuto sul palato la sensazione della sua pelle, che odorava di prugna fresca, e la notte, in questo freddo milanese, ho avvertito il suo fiato ancora di bambina, come un velo di tepore ingenuo sulle mie palpebre invecchiate. Non so come gli scienziati spieghino l'esistenza, dentro la nostra materia corporale, di questi altri organi di senso occulti, senza corpo visibile e segregati dagli oggetti, ma pur capaci di udire, di vedere e di ogni sensazione della natura e anche di altre. Si direbbero forniti di antenne e scandagli, agiscono in una zona esclusa dello spazio, però di movimento illimitato, e là, in quella zona, si avvera, almeno finché noi viviamo, la resurrezione carnale dei morti. So what for Dante is the sort of like moment forward, where the person will gain their body back and will be able to embrace their beloved the way they couldn't on the shores of Purgatory, is inverted in terms of temporality in Morante and becomes a journey backward. And the resurrection of the dead becomes the possibility to reactivate those bodily memories, those memories that have been created with the relation, in the relation with the other, and that are carried by the body. Okay? So like what Morante allowed me to see and to understand is this sort of irreducible capability that the body has to carry memory that cannot be disciplined. Okay? What I wanted to show through Morante is a non-normative Dante or poem, when Dante clearly means the Divine Comedy, that at a certain point resists the discipline of Purgatory, and or one could also say the discipline through which the lyrical discourse has to go in order to join God, but that in a way combines both the idea of relinquishing the self in this merging with the other and the idea of continuing to desire that self as a part that does not want and cannot be relinquished because it is carried in the body. So like, this is a very sort of like maybe fast way in which I read the resurrection of the body in Dante through Morante. But if I just want to say one thing that maybe was not, that was mentioned before, is that this insistence on individuality that is one of the landmarks of the Divine Comedy. Auerbach is genius in this because he says that with Dante the representation of the European individual begins. It's people with histories, with memories, with desires. It's not like just types. At the same time, there is something about Dante that is also fascinating in its pushing the other pole, which is that precisely of this possession, of selflessness, of relinquishing this obsession with the ego. And that in a way is more Christian or medieval, but that through Petrolio I also read as imbued with sexuality. Okay, so like what Petrolio allows me to do is to understand that in relinquishing subjectivity in the union with the other, you sort of like replicate a paradoxical pleasure of a sexuality that is not domesticated. So, because in Petrolio you really have what is described is a series of sexual intercourses in which the protagonist really experiences the possibility to forget about his history, to destroy subjectivity, to let go this bourgeois closure in the union with the other. So, you know, what I read at the end of the Paradiso is, on the one hand, the desire to merge with God in an act of relinquishing of subjectivity that is also uber-sexual, and, on the other hand, the paradox of continuing to desire to maintain that subjectivity carried through the body as a significant aspect of one's own personality that does not want to go and will not go because it will be not disciplined. That's very briefly, in a way, one of the movements that I've tried to trace in the poem. And if I just can add, one thing that for me is also very important is the idea that Sarah Cole spoke about rappresentazione perspicua, perspicuous representation. For me it's the concept of form, which is also like very important in the moment in which I speak about this text. It's the concept of aesthetics. It's the way in which the form of textuality replicates the movement of sexuality. And this is what Sara, Laura, and Jürgen were saying. It's in Petrolio and in Pasolini, in Petrolio Divina Mimesis. It's a form that replicates this queer insofferenza, this queer unacceptance of mastery and possession and power. And in Araceli, it is more complicated. It's a subjectivity that is more fluid. It's Laura, how you were saying it. In Petroleum, you have the shattering of a formed subjectivity. In Araceli, you have this endorsement of a subjectivity that never, of a corporeality that never managed to be a subject, and that is pushed precisely in its non-edible character. And then you have the form of the Paradiso, where in the last 10 cantos, precisely, in spite of this progressive movement of the terza rima, you really have a sort of like fireworks, where logic is interrupted, where rationality is suspended, where temporality is inverted, and Dante manages to express this paradox of losing and constantly finding oneself. So this is very briefly, just to give you an idea of the diffraction that I have done. If now I have 1 second to think back of your point, because about maternal language, because I have discovered maternal language when I left Italy, because I was raised in a place, in a family with no dialects. My parents were coming from places, different places from where we lived. So sometimes they would speak dialects when they would go back to their own villages, but they did not speak dialect in my country. In Italy, we were not taught dialect. I just spoke Italian, and I did not even know that there was a maternal language. Then I left, and that's when suddenly you realize that actually, you feel very, intimate, affectionate. It's also very easy, in a way, to think, in my case, of Italians. And one of the reasons why I've written this text in Italian was precisely because at a certain point, with a certain age, you also give yourself some precisely non-disciplinary move, so like in spite of the fact that, I work abroad and that it would have been expected from me to write a book in English, I decided to write in Italian also as a way to be a little bit loyal to 3 authors that were precisely not doing what they were expected to do. But at the same time, I think that also what Sara was saying, I don't know what you also thought, English, this sort of like English that I am speaking, if it is English, it is also my language. It is also, and so like I hope that it has also changed my Italian. Whether in its clarity, sometimes people tell me, but this is an Anglicism, and that I'm happy, if people then maybe, I don't know, I'm happy that it is like that. That's also the fact that I keep this affective relationship with Italian, but that it is also become something more alive through my experiences abroad. is not something. At first I was a little bit ashamed. Come on, you write about Dante, Pasolini, and Morante with your Italian. You should really not be so Ulyssean. And then at a certain point I said, okay, but that's me. So like in a book where I have really tried to be myself with the help of all the people that have informed my life, my scholarship, and here it's an example, of people who have shaped me. I thought that it's fine if also like my Italian is not that pure anymore. It is certainly very effective, but it has also changed.
It's become more pure.
No, it has become clearer.
Clearer, yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So I don't know, like this is just to say maybe how I think about, my my relationship with language. Maybe it's not correct, but for me it was interesting that Italian became an eternal language after I left it, I think.